There are wounds that never leave a scar, yet they can destroy a person's spirit long before anyone notices. For 10 years, one woman woke up every morning carrying a shame that was never hers. She smiled through family gatherings where every glance felt like a judgment, every whispered conversation sounded like another accusation, and every holiday reminded her of the child everyone believed she had failed to bring into the world. She prayed, she cried, she endured endless medical appointments, and she held on to a marriage that seemed to grow heavier with every passing year. Then, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, everything changed. A family photograph crashed onto the dining table as an angry mother-in-law pointed at the woman she had blamed for a decade and shouted, 10 years. 10 years without a single child. This family name ends because of you. The room fell silent. The wife lowered her head, unable to defend herself against words she had heard too many times before. Her husband tightened his fists, torn between protecting the woman he loved and respecting the mother who had raised him. It looked like another painful argument that would end exactly as all the others had. But this time, there was one person sitting quietly in the room who had something no one else possessed. The family's physician reached into his leather briefcase, placed a thick medical file on the table, slowly turned through years of reports, paused on a single page, and looked directly at the older woman before speaking the words that would bring an entire family to a standstill. "Mrs. Carter, you've been blaming the wrong person." In that instant, the accusation stopped, the anger disappeared, and 10 years of certainty began to crumble. For 10 long years, one innocent woman had carried a burden that never belonged to her. She lost her confidence, her happiness, her peace of mind, and nearly the love of her life because everyone believed they already knew the truth. Yet the truth had been sitting quietly inside a medical record, overlooked, misunderstood, waiting for someone willing to ask one more question. What that doctor uncovered would force every member of the family to confront the consequences of their own assumptions, and before this story reaches its end, you'll understand how a single misunderstanding can reshape lives for years. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Imagine spending 10 years searching for an answer that refuses to come. Imagine hearing doctors repeatedly tell you that everything appears normal while the people closest to you become more convinced that you are hiding the truth. Imagine watching friends celebrate pregnancies, baby showers, birthdays, and family milestones while you quietly wonder why your own prayers remain unanswered. This is a story inspired by countless real-life experiences shared by couples across America who have faced infertility, family pressure, miscommunication, and heartbreaking assumptions. It is a story about love tested by time, about loyalty placed under enormous strain, and about how quickly people can judge someone without knowing the complete picture. Over the next few minutes, you'll discover why every medical examination seemed to point in one direction while the real answer remained hidden in plain sight. You'll learn why one experienced physician refused to accept what everyone else had already concluded. You'll see how a decade of emotional pain began with a mistake so small that no one believed it could change an entire family's future. Most importantly, you'll witness the moment when years of blame collided with undeniable evidence, leaving those who spoke the harshest words to face the weight of their own decisions. As each chapter unfolds, new questions will replace old assumptions. Why couldn't Ethan and Grace have children despite years of trying? Why did every major fertility test appear reassuring while their lives continued to fall apart? What important detail had everyone missed for an entire decade? Why did one doctor refuse to close the file when everyone else believed there was nothing left to investigate? And when the truth finally emerged, would it heal a broken family, or would it reveal wounds too deep to repair? Stay with us until the very end, because the answer changed everything they believed about love, family, forgiveness, and the price of judging someone before knowing the whole story. Long before Grace Carter became the woman everyone blamed for a child that never came, she was simply the young woman who captured Ethan Carter's heart during their sophomore year at college. They met by chance in the university library after reaching for the same book, laughed about the awkward moment, and ended up talking until the building closed for the evening. What started as a brief conversation quickly grew into a friendship built on trust, shared dreams, and an effortless understanding that neither of them had experienced before. Friends often joked that they behaved like an old married couple long before Ethan ever bought a ring. They studied together, celebrated each other's achievements, survived difficult semesters, and encouraged one another through every disappointment life placed in their path. While other relationships around them came and went, theirs continued to grow stronger. The people closest to them admired the way they communicated, the respect they showed each other, and the calm confidence that seemed to define their relationship. Many believed they had found the kind of love most people spend a lifetime searching for. Looking back years later, those memories would become painfully important because they reminded everyone that before the accusations, before the tears, and before the family was divided, there had once been genuine happiness. After graduation, Ethan proposed during a quiet weekend at the small lakeside park where they had shared their very first date. There were no television cameras, no elaborate surprises, and no audience waiting to applaud. It was just two people promising to build a life together regardless of what the future might hold. Grace said yes before Ethan could even finish asking the question, and within months, both families gathered to celebrate a wedding filled with laughter, tears of joy, heartfelt speeches, and endless optimism about the years ahead. Friends described them as the couple most likely to grow old together. Their wedding photographs reflected everything people hoped marriage could be: genuine smiles, proud parents, lifelong friends, and two people completely convinced they were stepping into the happiest chapter of their lives. Shortly after returning from their honeymoon, they purchased a modest home in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't the largest house on the street, but to Ethan and Grace, it represented everything they had worked so hard to achieve. Together they painted the walls, assembled furniture late into the night, planted flowers in the front yard, and talked excitedly about filling every empty room with memories. One bedroom remained untouched because they already knew exactly what it would become. They called it the nursery long before there was any reason to do so. Grace spent weekends browsing baby furniture online while Ethan carefully measured the room, discussing where the crib should stand and where sunlight would fall through the windows each morning. They debated paint colors, laughed over children's storybooks, and even kept a notebook filled with baby names they both loved. If they had a daughter, Grace dreamed of naming her Charlotte after her grandmother. If they had a son, Ethan hoped for Benjamin because it reminded him of his late father. Those conversations filled their evenings with excitement rather than pressure. They imagined birthday parties in the backyard, bedtime stories, first days of school, family vacations, and holiday mornings surrounded by children opening presents beneath the Christmas tree. Every plan they made seemed to include the family they believed would arrive in time. Neither of them imagined those dreams would remain untouched for years, quietly collecting dust alongside unopened boxes in a room that was never occupied. To anyone watching from the outside, Ethan and Grace appeared to have everything a young couple could possibly want. Stable careers, a loving marriage, supportive friends, good health, and a future overflowing with possibility. It seemed as though nothing could stand in their way. During the first year of marriage, neither of them worried when pregnancy didn't happen immediately. They had heard countless stories from relatives and friends explaining that sometimes these things simply took time. They remained hopeful, continued enjoying life together, and believed the good news would come sooner rather than later. Every month brought fresh anticipation followed by quiet disappointment, but they comforted one another with reassuring smiles and promises that next month would surely be different. By the time their first wedding anniversary arrived, they celebrated with the same love they had always shared, choosing to focus on each other rather than what was still missing. Then the second year passed. Once again, there was no pregnancy announcement, no ultrasound photographs, and no joyful phone calls to their families. What had once felt like a temporary delay slowly became a question that refused to disappear. Friends who married after them were now welcoming their first children into the world. Family gatherings gradually shifted from cheerful conversations to uncomfortable questions that lingered longer than either Ethan or Grace wanted to answer. At first the questions came gently, wrapped in smiles and good intentions. Then they became more frequent, more personal, and impossible to ignore. Neither Ethan nor Grace realized it yet, but the life they had worked so hard to build was about to face a challenge far greater than either of them had ever imagined. Little did they know, the real nightmare hadn't even begun. The first few questions came wrapped in kindness, the sort of questions people ask without realizing how deeply they can hurt. "Any good news yet? When are you two going to make us grandparents? Have you started thinking about names?" Ethan and Grace smiled politely every time, offering the same hopeful response that they were trusting the timing would be right. Most people accepted the answer and moved on, but others continued pressing for details, convinced they were simply being encouraging. What no one saw was the conversation that happened every time they returned home. Grace would quietly place her purse on the kitchen counter, force a smile that lasted only a few seconds, and then retreat to the bedroom where she could finally let the tears fall without anyone watching. Ethan would follow a few moments later, wrapping his arms around her and reminding her that they were in this together. He never blamed her. He never raised his voice. He never suggested giving up. Instead, he reminded her that the family they dreamed about was worth waiting for. Those quiet moments became the foundation that held their marriage together as the years continued slipping away. By the third year, it felt as though the entire world had entered a season of celebration while Ethan and Grace remained trapped in endless waiting. One by one, the couples they had attended college with began sharing pregnancy announcements across social media. Every few weeks another smiling photograph appeared with tiny baby shoes, ultrasound pictures, or balloons revealing pink or blue. Weekend calendars filled with baby showers, gender reveal parties, first birthdays, and christenings. Grace attended each event with genuine happiness for her friends, but every celebration reminded her of the life she had imagined for herself. She bought thoughtful gifts, smiled for photographs, and congratulated every growing family, yet each drive home became quieter than the last. Ethan noticed how she stared silently through the passenger window after every party, pretending to admire the scenery while secretly wondering why life seemed to move so easily for everyone else. Eventually, Grace stopped accepting invitations altogether. She told friends she was busy with work or feeling under the weather, but the truth was much harder to admit. Watching everyone else's dreams come true while hers remained out of reach had become more painful than she could bear. As Grace slowly withdrew from family celebrations, Ethan's mother, Margaret Carter, became less patient and more outspoken. At first, her comments sounded almost harmless. She suggested herbal remedies she had read about online, recommended different diets, and insisted they visit specialists she believed could solve the problem. When those ideas produced no results, her tone began to change. Every visit to her home included another pointed remark, another uncomfortable question, another reminder that the Carter family had always been known for large gatherings filled with children. She rarely addressed Ethan directly. Instead, every comment seemed carefully aimed at Grace, as though she alone carried responsibility for their circumstances. Family dinners became emotional minefields where Grace never knew what criticism might come next. Ethan repeatedly defended his wife, reminding his mother that fertility was a complex issue affecting many couples and that assigning blame helped no one. Margaret would usually fall silent for a moment, only to return to the same subject before the evening was over. The tension grew stronger with every passing month, leaving Grace increasingly anxious whenever another family gathering appeared on the calendar. Then came the afternoon that changed the relationship between Grace and her mother-in-law forever. Without warning, Margaret arrived at Ethan and Grace's home accompanied by a younger woman she introduced as the daughter of an old family friend. She praised the woman's education, her kindness, and, most noticeably, her large family filled with nieces and nephews. The conversation quickly became uncomfortable as Margaret openly suggested that Ethan deserved the opportunity to become a father, even if it meant starting over with someone else. Grace sat frozen in disbelief while Ethan struggled to process what he was hearing. The suggestion was no longer hidden beneath polite conversation or indirect comments. It was spoken aloud in the middle of their living room. Before leaving, Margaret looked directly at Grace and declared that perhaps she had been cursed, insisting there had to be a reason why 10 years of marriage had produced no child. The words echoed through the house long after the front door closed. Grace remained seated in silence, unable to find the strength to respond, while Ethan apologized repeatedly for something he had never imagined his own mother would say. Although Ethan continued standing firmly beside his wife in public, a quiet struggle had begun inside him. He never questioned Grace's character, never doubted her love, and never considered leaving her as his mother suggested. Yet late at night, after Grace had fallen asleep, he often found himself sitting alone in the living room asking questions that had no answers. How could every medical report say they were healthy while year after year passed without a pregnancy? Why did every specialist offer hope but no explanation? Was there something everyone had somehow overlooked? He hated himself for even wondering, because each unanswered question felt like a betrayal of the woman he loved most. Still, uncertainty has a way of creeping into even the strongest hearts when time continues to pass without answers. Then, just as another disappointing year seemed ready to fade into the next, an unexpected envelope arrived in their mailbox. It bore the letterhead of a fertility clinic they had visited months earlier, and the words inside would set in motion a chain of events that neither Ethan nor Grace could have imagined. The envelope from the fertility clinic did not contain the miracle Ethan and Grace had prayed for. Instead, it recommended another round of evaluations and encouraged them to schedule a comprehensive review with a new reproductive specialist. At first, Grace hesitated. After nearly 10 years of appointments, waiting rooms, blood draws, and carefully measured hope, she wasn't sure she could endure another cycle of anticipation followed by disappointment. Every new appointment had always begun with optimism and ended with another unanswered question. Ethan understood her exhaustion, but he gently reminded her that if there was even the smallest chance of finding an answer, they owed it to themselves to keep going. They had promised each other from the beginning that they would face every challenge together, and neither of them wanted to look back one day wondering whether they had given up too soon. So, once again, they cleared their work schedules, gathered years' worth of medical records into thick folders, and returned to the place that had become all too familiar, a hospital where hope and heartbreak often shared the same waiting room. Over the following months, their lives became organized around appointments, laboratory visits, and consultations with specialists who each believed they might discover the missing piece of the puzzle. Grace underwent another series of blood tests, each one examining hormone levels that had already been checked more times than she could count. She endured additional ultrasounds that confirmed what previous physicians had documented for years. Everything appeared normal. Ethan completed his own examinations without hesitation, determined to leave no question unanswered. More laboratory work followed. More detailed evaluations. More conversations filled with cautious optimism. Every appointment seemed to end the same way. The doctor would review the reports carefully, look up with a reassuring smile, and explain that the results looked encouraging. Healthy. 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 The word that once brought comfort slowly became a source of frustration because it never explained why their dream remained just beyond reach. Every encouraging report only deepened the mystery they were trying so desperately to solve. Outside the hospital, Ethan and Grace refused to rely on medicine alone. They committed themselves to improving every aspect of their lives, convinced that perhaps one small change could finally make the difference. On quiet Wednesday evenings, they attended prayer meetings where couples gathered to support one another through similar struggles. They listened to stories of perseverance, shared tears with complete strangers, and found comfort in knowing they were not alone. Grace often prayed silently, asking only for peace if the answer she longed for never arrived. Ethan prayed for strength, believing that whatever happened, he wanted his marriage to survive the weight of disappointment. They also met with a marriage counselor who encouraged open communication during a season when many couples found themselves drifting apart. Rather than allowing resentment to grow, Ethan and Grace learned to speak honestly about their fears, their hopes, and the emotional exhaustion neither wanted the other to carry alone. Those conversations strengthened their relationship, but they could not erase the growing pressure from family members, especially Margaret Carter, whose impatience only seemed to intensify with every passing year. If their medical reports consistently showed no obvious explanation, then what exactly had everyone been missing? The deeper they searched, the more confusing the situation became. Every answer created a bigger question, and for the first time, even the audience following their journey might begin asking a troubling possibility. Was someone hiding something, or had everyone simply overlooked a detail that had been there all along? Several weeks later, their complete medical history was transferred to another physician for an independent review. Unlike the specialists before him, this doctor didn't begin by ordering new tests. Instead, he spent hours quietly reading through nearly a decade of laboratory reports, consultation notes, imaging studies, and physician observations. Page after page, he compared dates, signatures, measurements, and recommendations, refusing to rush through information that others had already accepted. Then, almost imperceptibly, he paused. His eyes returned to one report from years earlier. He read it again. He compared it with another document. Then another. Something about the sequence didn't make sense. It wasn't a dramatic discovery or an obvious mistake that anyone could have noticed at first glance. It was a small inconsistency hidden among hundreds of pages, the kind of detail most people would overlook without a second thought. The doctor closed the file, reached for an older set of records, and quietly requested documents from a laboratory that had not been contacted in years. At that moment, Ethan and Grace had no idea that one careful observation was about to unravel everything their family believed to be true. The physician who accepted Ethan and Grace Carter's case was Dr. Andrew Mitchell, a reproductive endocrinologist with more than 3 decades of experience helping couples whose situations had left other specialists searching for answers. His reputation had never been built on dramatic promises or miracle cures. Instead, colleagues respected him for something much less common. He was patient. He listened carefully. He questioned assumptions that others accepted without hesitation, and he believed that every unanswered case deserved one more careful review before anyone concluded there was no explanation. Patients often described him as the kind of doctor who never seemed rushed. During consultations, he allowed silence to do its work, giving families time to explain details they might otherwise overlook. More he noticed that every specialist seemed to rely heavily on one particular report completed during the early years of Ethan and Grace's marriage. That document appeared repeatedly throughout the file, referenced by physicians who trusted its conclusions without questioning how those conclusions had originally been reached. At first glance, nothing about the report appeared alarming. Yet something about it refused to sit comfortably in Dr. Mitchell's mind. He couldn't immediately explain why, but years of experience had taught him never to ignore that quiet feeling when the pieces of a story failed to fit together. He immediately contacted the records department and requested copies of every laboratory submission connected to Ethan and Grace's earliest fertility evaluations, including archived files that had not been reviewed in years. Several days later, boxes of archived records began arriving from facilities that had treated the couple throughout the previous decade. Dr. Mitchell realized he was getting closer, but he still lacked one critical piece needed to understand exactly what had happened. As he assembled the final group of documents, the picture became clearer, though not in the way anyone would have expected. He paused for a brief moment before sliding certified copies of the original documentation across the table. One of the early laboratory samples was mislabeled during administrative processing. The discrepancy triggered an internal verification process, but the supporting documentation explaining that correction was gradually separated from the working medical file as records were transferred between facilities over the years. As a result, later physicians never received the complete context surrounding those early findings. Ethan leaned forward without saying a word. Grace looked from one page to another, struggling to understand what she was reading. That is why I ordered fresh testing using current standards while independently verifying every archived record. He opened another folder containing the newest laboratory results and placed them beside the original documents. The updated evaluations provide a complete picture that was never available during the earlier years of treatment. They demonstrate that Grace's reproductive health was not the source of the problem everyone believed it to be. The conclusions reached throughout much of the past decade were built upon a chain of administrative errors, incomplete record transfers, and assumptions that no one realized needed to be challenged. Grace carried responsibility for something the medical evidence does not support. For several long seconds, no one moved. The room became so quiet that even the soft ticking of the clock on the wall seemed unusually loud. Margaret Carter stared at the report spread across the table, reading the same lines repeatedly as though hoping they might somehow change. Every harsh accusation she had made over the past 10 years echoed through her mind. She remembered the family dinners where she had embarrassed Grace, the holidays she had ruined with cruel remarks, the afternoon she had brought another woman into Ethan and Grace's home, and the painful moment she had called her own daughter-in-law cursed. She had convinced herself that she was protecting her family's future, yet every judgment had rested upon a belief that was never fully supported by the complete medical record. Her shoulders slowly dropped as the weight of that realization settled over her. Across the table, Ethan turned toward his wife without speaking. He reached for Grace's trembling hand and held it tightly, as though trying to make up for every tear she had cried while carrying a burden that had never truly belonged to her. Grace looked down at the reports, then quietly closed her eyes. For the first time in 10 years, the truth had finally been spoken aloud, and no one in the room could find the words to break the silence. No one rushed to leave the room. The truth had finally been revealed, yet it brought no celebration. It only exposed the weight of 10 years that could never be returned. Margaret Carter remained seated, staring at the report spread across the table as tears slowly filled her eyes. The same woman who had once spoken with absolute certainty now struggled to say even a single sentence. She looked across the table at Grace, but for several moments, she couldn't bring herself to meet her eyes. The silence became almost unbearable. Finally, Margaret stood, took a slow step forward, and with a trembling voice that barely rose above a whisper, she said, "Grace, I don't know if words can ever repair what I've done. For years, I believed I was protecting my son and our family. I convinced myself that I was right, and because of that, I stopped seeing your pain. Every cruel word I spoke, every accusation I made, every family gathering I turned into a trial. I can never take those moments back. I judged you without knowing the truth, and I made your life far more difficult than it ever should have been. I am so deeply sorry." Before anyone could respond, tears rolled freely down her face. They were not the tears of someone who had lost an argument. They were the tears of someone who had finally realized the damage her own certainty had caused. Grace listened quietly without interrupting. For years she had imagined what this moment might look like. There had been nights when she prayed Margaret would one day understand. There had been mornings when she believed that day would never come. Yet now that the apology had finally arrived, forgiveness was not as simple as she once imagined. Some wounds begin to heal the moment the truth is spoken, while others remain long after the apologies have been made. Grace looked at Margaret with compassion, but also with the quiet sadness of someone who had spent a decade carrying pain that never belonged to her. Those memories could not disappear in a single afternoon. They had become part of her story. She slowly stood from her chair, looked at Margaret, and spoke with remarkable calm. "I appreciate your apology. I know it took courage to say those words. Sometimes forgiveness begins with understanding, but trust returns much more slowly." Ethan stood quietly beside his wife, his hand never leaving hers. Throughout 10 years of uncertainty, he had tried to protect the woman he loved while also holding together the family that had raised him. He often wondered whether he could have done more, spoken louder, defended Grace more forcefully when accusations became unbearable. He cared about giving Grace the peace she had been denied for so long. Stories like Ethan and Grace's remind us that some of life's greatest tragedies are not always caused by disease or misfortune. Sometimes they begin with conclusions reached before all the facts are known. Across the country, many couples facing infertility carry emotional burdens that those around them never fully understand. Medical experts consistently encourage evaluating both partners because fertility challenges can have many different causes, and assigning blame to one person without complete information can create lasting emotional harm. Grace's greatest struggle was never simply the unanswered questions about becoming a mother. It was carrying the weight of accusations that should never have been placed upon her in the first place. Margaret's greatest lesson was discovering that confidence without compassion can wound the very people we claim to love. Ethan's greatest lesson was learning that standing beside someone in difficult moments is not only about loyalty but also about having the courage to challenge assumptions, even when they come from those closest to us. Some wounds are caused by illness. Others are caused by assumptions. If you had been in Grace's position, could you forgive after 10 years of blame? Or do you believe some wounds can never fully heal? Share your thoughts in the comments below because we genuinely love to hear your perspective. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another unforgettable story. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.